Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from The Hindu and The Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to Environment Impact Assessment and Environment Audit Rules. The Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has brought into effect the rules which allow the monitoring to go beyond the remit of the state pollution control boards. The second article is related to the opening up of the nuclear sector as the government aims to liberalize the nuclear sector to bring in the private players. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the Environment Impact Assessment and the Environment Audit Rules 2025. These rules have been put in place by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. They allow the monitoring to go beyond the remit of the state pollution control boards now. They prescribe for the establishment of the audit agency, the environmental audit agency, putting in place a two-tiered system of the auditors, the environmental auditors. So we will discuss the topic of environment impact assessment comprehensively, taking up the process of EIA in India, the evolution of EIA regulations in India, the judicial approach towards environmental impact assessment, the international principles related to EIA and a few suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS3 under the topic Conservation, Environmental Pollution and Degradation and Environment Impact Assessment. First, what is EIA? Every individual, every nation seeks development, but the development comes at a cost. The cost is borne by the Mother Earth, and some damage is caused to the environment in the process whenever any developmental activity is taking place. The EIA is the tool to estimate the potential damage that may be caused to the environment because of the developmental activities which are proposed and to suggest the mitigation measures to minimize the damage that may be caused to the environment during such developmental project or activity. In India, we started the EIA in 1970s when we were taking up the River Valley projects. And now the clearances for environmental clearance are granted by the Impact Assessment Agency under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So what is the process of EIA? How does it function? During the environment impact assessment, first screening is done, screening of the project to determine whether an EIA is required for the project. For example, some projects get exemptions on the basis of strategic exemptions, scale exemptions. For example, since 2013, some exemptions are given for the linear projects which are less than 100 kilometers. For example, the highways spanning less than 100 kilometers, there the clearance level is less than that which is required for the linear projects of more than 100 kilometers distance. So there are certain exemptions. Then the next step is scoping, to determine what will be the scope of the environment impact assessment study, to determine what are the issues which need to be studied, to determine what may be the impact, and that impact is assessed in the next stage. During the impact assessment, both the positives and the negatives of the project are determined. For example, what may be the positive developmental impacts, what may be the negative environmental impact, the negative social impact also is considered sometimes. And once the impact assessment is done, then the next step is to determine the mitigation measures, to propose the measures to reverse or potentially minimize the environmental damage that may be caused because of the development project. The mitigation measures, once that is done, the public participation is encouraged. The public is also consulted through the Gram Sabha, for example, conducting meetings, consultations, etc. Their feedback is taken up and then the reporting takes place. The reporting is done, for example, through the preparation of an environmental impact statement, to comprehensively tabulate the data, the content so collected, and prepare a report so that the authorities can make the decision. The decision is taken up by the authorities whether the project will have significant positives, significant developmental impact so as to balance the adverse ecological impact, else it may be shelved also because of serious or irreversible environmental damage. Even after the project gets the approval, even after that, continuous monitoring also has to be done to ensure that the compliance is being done, the compliance with the regulations, and the conditional clearances, if granted, then the conditions are also met by the proponents of the project. So this is the process of environment impact assessment. Now let's discuss what is the impact of constitution on the evolution of EIA in India. Initially, the constitution did not contain explicit provisions for the environment conservation. When we gained independence in 1947, our priority was development. We prioritized development over environmental conservation. But through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976, environmentalism was also introduced in the constitution. For example, the addition of a directive principle, Article 48A, which casts a duty upon the state, which directs the state to protect and conserve the natural environment. It also included a fundamental duty under Article 51A Clause G that ensures that the citizens, they have the duty. It is casting a duty upon the individual to protect the natural environment. Then the judiciary also played its role. For example, it went for a liberal interpretation of Article 21. Article 21 provides for the right to life and personal liberty. The judiciary interpreted it liberally by holding that the right to healthy environment can also be held to be implicitly part of Article 21. It even went on to hold that the displacement which may be caused because of the developmental activities and the environmental degradation or the cutting of the forests, which may affect the livelihoods of the forest dwellers, and therefore the right to livelihood, it is also part of the Article 21 implicitly, that may be impacted adversely if the environment is damaged. And the judiciary also went for a balancing of the rights. It held that there is a right to freedom of trade under Article 19 Clause 1 Clause G, that the developmental activities should be there, but along with the right to freedom of trade and profession, there has to be a balance along with the rights under Article 14, the right to equality, right under Article 21, right to life and personal liberty, and the directive principle under Article 48A, as well as the fundamental duty under Article 51A Clause G. There has to be a balance between these, and the implementation of the international law can be done, the signing of the international treaties, customs, conventions, if it is done by India, then the parliament can go ahead and implement those treaties by resorting to Article 253. Therefore, the environmental treaties, the environmental conventions, if India becomes a party to, that can be implemented in India. Additionally, the court also came up with a few doctrines. For the environmentalism in India, it evolved the precautionary principle. Precautionary principle means that action has to be taken even if there is a potential damage that may be caused to the environment because of a developmental activity. We cannot wait for a scientific evidence, conclusive scientific evidence to come out that this will definitely cause harm to the environment. Therefore, better safe than sorry, that is precautionary principle, and it is essentially shifting the burden to the project proponent, that he has to prove that the project which is proposed, it will not cause damage to the environment, the harm to the environment. And the court also held that the principles of sustainable development and the precautionary principle, they are integral to the Indian environmental jurisprudence as held in multiple cases. And the court also held that we have to abide by the public trust doctrine, that the state is the trustee of the natural resources. The state is not the absolute owner, rather the state is holding them in public trust, and it has the duty, it is obligated to protect the natural resources to ensure it is done for the public good. Now let's analyze the evolution of the regulations related to environment impact assessment in India. Before 1994, there was no formal EIA notification in India. Rather, it was the judicial spirit which was trying to minimize the environmental damage which may be caused because of the development projects. For example, the Dehradun quarrying case before the 1994. The 1994 EIA notification was the first formal notification for environment impact assessment in India. It mandated the environmental clearance for the listed projects, and it provided for the establishment of an impact assessment agency. But there were major drawbacks in the notification of 1994 as observed by the Govindarajan committee, that the process under the EIA notification was cumbersome and it was very slow, which led to the delays in the projects getting clearances, the environmental clearances, and even the EIAs that were done, they were of poor quality. For example, the Ratnagiri project. There, the experts, they copied pasted the Russian EIA for the Indian project in Ratnagiri. Therefore, there was plagiarism also which was done, and the notification went for an investment based criteria, creating exemptions from EIA. For example, the projects with investment of less than 100 crores, there the criteria was not as stringent and there were exemptions created from the EIA for them, proposing that the environmental damage that may be caused because of them, that will not be significant. After 1994, therefore, there were a series of amendments to the 1994 notification. For example, there was some strengthening of the environmental impact assessment also, like the inclusion of the public hearings. It was started from 1997, it was mandated, for example, through the Gram Sabhas, the public consultation, and the location sensitive clauses were also included. For example, the protection of the ecologically sensitive regions, for example, the ban on the Aravali mining in 2002-2003. But there was simultaneously some dilution also of the 1994 notification. For example, the 2002 amendment, the investment based clauses, and subsequently the investment based clauses like the exemptions given to less than 100 crore investments, it led to the ignoring of social impact also. For example, the displacement is caused even by the establishment of small hydel plants, the small hydropower projects, but there the societal impact was ignored because of the exemption created under the EIA. Then the EIA notification of 2006 brought in a major overhaul. There was a decentralization of the EIA which was done. The projects were categorized into two categories, category A and category B. The category A projects were, appraisal was done by the central government and the category B by the state government, and the process was improved. For example, the scoping was included, that is, the terms of reference have to be determined for the environmental appraisal committee to determine what can be the issues and what may be the probable impact because of the proposed project. But there were shortcomings even after the notification of 2006. For example, the public participation remained weak. Like the NGOs, they were excluded from the process of EIA, and the government authorities were not participating in the process of EIA. And even the post monitoring was not effective. The project, even if it is given the environmental clearance, has to be monitored so as to ensure that the conditions which were imposed while granting it environmental clearance, they are adhered to, they are followed. On the other hand, rather reliance was placed on the uprightness of the proponent of the project. For example, if the environmental appraisal committee could not set the terms of reference, then the project proponent himself could set the terms of reference for the environmental impact assessment. Then the EIA notification 2009 was brought. There the measures were included for enhancing the transparency. For example, the project proponent was required to publish the environmental clearance along with the conditions imposed with the environmental clearance in the newspapers and also publish it on his website. Simultaneously, the categorization of the projects was refined. For example, higher threshold limits were imposed upon certain projects like thermal plants and the highways, etc. But certain issues remained persistent. For example, the politicization of the environmental appraisal committees, the alleged politicization and the nepotism in the committees, and there was a lack of cumulative assessment also. The cumulative assessment has to be done while determining the environmental impact of a developmental project. Rather, the EIA studies, they were doing the impact assessment of that particular project only on the environment of the region. Rather, the cumulative assessment will require the impact assessment of all the projects in that region on the damage that will be caused to the environment in the region. That was not done. Simultaneously, even the health impact studies were inadequate. as the health professionals, public health professionals were not included in the environmental appraisal committees. We can look at the case study of the Char Dham project also. The Char Dham is a project to improve the connectivity between the Char Dhams, that is Kedarnath, Badrinath, Yamunotri and Gangotri. The roads were supposed to be widened. The project is nearing completion actually now, but the Char Dham project was rather split into more than 50 civil works to avail the exemption from the EIA, to break it down into less than 100-kilometer linear projects. Then the government came up with the draft EIA notification in 2020. There the ex post facto clearance was also proposed, that the projects which were started illegally without getting the environmental clearance, they could also be given ex post facto clearance as well, although this was held to be unconstitutional and illegal by the Supreme Court in Alembic Pharmaceuticals case. And there was an erosion of public participation also through the draft notification of 2020. For example, the strategic exemption was allowed to the projects which were deemed to be strategic, and this term was not defined and it remained vague. Simultaneously, even the exemption was proposed for the capacity enhancement, that is the existing projects. If they were going for the enhancement of capacity by up to 50%, there the fresh environmental impact assessment was exempted. And even the reporting of violations, that could be done by either the project proponent himself or the authorities or the government. And simultaneously, even the compliance was also diluted, and there were mass exemptions that were created, as more than 40 exemptions were created under the draft EIA notification of 2020. Now, what is the judicial approach towards environmental impact assessment in India? The judiciary has been largely inclined towards the promotion of environmentalism, towards the evolution of principles like precautionary principle, the sustainable development principle, etc. For example, the Narmada Bachao Andolan versus Union of India, the Sardar Sarovar Dam case. There the court came up with a balancing test, that we have to balance the priorities. On the one hand, there is a priority to minimize the adverse ecological impact, minimize the damage to environment. On the other hand, there is the national interest. The Sardar Sarovar Dam, that is in the national interest, as it will be fulfilling the drinking water needs, power needs as well as irrigation needs of the region, but both the priorities have to be balanced. Therefore, it gave a conditional construction permit, that up to 90 meters of height you can go ahead and construct the Sardar Sarovar Dam unconditionally, but beyond 90 meters height, first an environmental clearance should be taken by the government. Therefore, it simultaneously gave a mandate for the monitoring of the project also, that the monitoring will be done by the Narmada Control Authority regarding the implementation of the project, and also for the rehabilitation of the displaced persons. In the KM Chinnappa versus Union of India, the Kudremukh mining case, the court observed that in the park you cannot do mining without the environmental impact assessment. The EIA was held to be mandatory. In MC Mehta versus Union of India, the Taj Corridor case, the court held that we will have zero tolerance for violations. It ordered a CBI inquiry, ordered FIR against high-ranking officials, and it even observed that there can be an ex post facto scrutiny also, that even after the project is completed, even after that a scrutiny can be done if the environmental clearance was not taken prior. In MC Mehta versus Union of India, another case, in Aravali mining case, the court applied the precautionary principle. That is, the mining was banned in the Aravalis even before there was conclusive scientific evidence that it is causing irreversible harm to the ecology in the region. Therefore, mining was banned near the tourist sites including Badkal Lake, Surajkund, and it applied therefore the sustainable development test. In Lafarge Mining versus Union of India case in Meghalaya, the court observed that the government should put in place a national regulator for ensuring that there is proper environmental clearance which is given, because the court cited deficiencies in the appraisal mechanism, the environmental appraisal mechanism that is put in place by the government. In Deepak Kumar versus State of Haryana, the sand mining case, the court observed that the environmental clearance is mandatory for the mining of minor minerals also, for example sand. as it may also cause significant adverse ecological impact. For example, currently the cause of the flooding in Punjab, that can also be attributed to an extent to illegal sand mining in some regions. In Sundarajan versus Union of India, the court observed in the Kudankulam nuclear plant case that the safety will override the opposition from the side of the public. That even if there is opposition from the public, but the expert committee has observed that the safety can be ensured, then the project can be given a go ahead. In Alaknanda Hydropower Company case in the Srinagar Dam in Uttarakhand, the court observed that the EIA application can be done only prospectively, not retrospectively. If the project is 95% complete and the application of EIA was not required prior to 1994, then the application cannot be done retrospectively, and therefore, although the court imposed a moratorium on the future hydropower construction projects in Uttarakhand. In Sterlite Industries versus Union of India case in the Tuticorin plant case, the court observed that the old clearances, they remain valid. If the clearance was obtained before 1994, at that time rapid EIA was required, then they will remain valid. There will be no retrospective application for the EIA again. In Odisha Mining Corporation case, that is the Vedanta mining in the Niyamgiri hills in Odisha, the court observed that the tribal rights have to be protected. They are paramount, as the rights of the Dongriya Khon tribals in Odisha were violated because of the bauxite mining by Vedanta in Odisha. Simultaneously, the court observed that the consent has to be taken from the tribal Gram Sabha, and the compliance with the Forest Rights Act therefore has to be ensured. In Alembic Pharmaceuticals case, the court observed that ex post facto granting of the environmental clearance is illegal. That is, once the project was started and it is functioning without even getting the environmental clearance, then the ex post facto clearance cannot be given, and the court therefore applied the principle of proportionality. Rather than shutting down the project altogether, the court considered that significant investment has gone into it and employment is created by it. Therefore, it rather imposed heavy fines, 10 crore rupees per unit, and allowed it to function. Now let's discuss some international principles also which promote the concept of EIA. The Stockholm Declaration in 1972, specifically through Principle 21, provides that the states have the duty to prevent transboundary harm. The states, even if they are taking up any activity within their own jurisdiction, within their own domain, they should not cause transboundary environmental damage. The states do have the sovereign rights for the utilization of the natural resources within their own territory, but that does not give them the right to damage the environment of another country. The Brundtland report in 1987 observed that the planet has certain ecological limits. There are certain planetary ecological limits. To ensure that the ecological balance is not disturbed, the industrial output will have to be altered significantly. The Rio Declaration in 1992 through Principle 17 provided that EIA should be done, especially for those projects where there is a significant environmental damage that may be caused. Through the Agenda 21, it was proposed that the public participation, public consultation must be done while taking up the environmental impact assessment, and the World Summit on Sustainable Development provided that there should be an emphasis on EIA while forming the national policies as well. And the Earth Summit 2012, which is known as the Rio Plus 20 Summit, also provided that we should focus upon the green economy as well to ensure that the environmental damage is minimized. There are certain international instruments also. For example, the Espoo Convention in 1991 provided that the EIA should be done, and when the project is taken up in one country, then the impact is there on another country, then the affected country should also have the right to be consulted by the country which is taking up that project, which can cause the environmental damage. Even the people in the affected country should also have the say in the public participation, the public consultation of the EIA which is taken up by the state in which the project is being proposed as per the Espoo Convention. Through the UN clause Article 206 specifically, it provides the duty upon the states to ensure that the activities that they are taking up, if they are causing marine pollution specifically, then they should conduct an environmental impact assessment. The Paris Agreement, although it does not provide explicitly for environmental impact assessment, but it provides that the nations, they should go for the robust assessment criteria also while taking up the projects or while granting clearances to the projects. Now the EIA is also having a role in ensuring the sustainable development also. For example, for ensuring sustainable development, we have to ensure the welfare of the people, and EIA will ensure that the participation of the people is also taken into account when they will be affected by the project which is proposed. Similarly, the protection of the planet will be ensured through the verification of the projects and determining their negative environmental consequences also. It will ensure prosperity as well as it will enhance the quality of life in the society while minimizing the hazards to the environment and ensuring the peace in the world as well and stability in the region, as well as it will encourage the adoption of uniform environmental conditions in all countries as well. Now coming to the audit rules 2025, they have been proposed and put in place by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. It puts in place a two-tiered system of auditors. There will be certified environment auditor and there will be registered environment auditors. What will be the roles and responsibilities of these registered environment auditors? They will be going for the sampling and analysis of the emissions, effluents, waste, discharges from the industries. They will also be reporting if there are any violations which is done by the project proponents, or they will also be reporting the non-compliance as well. They will be computing the environmental compensation in case there are violations, in case there are non-compliances, then how much fine should be imposed upon them. They will be also conducting the verification activities related to the green credit registry as well as preparing the audit report. The audit rules propose the establishment of an environment audit designated agency which will be providing for the certification of the environment auditors and the registration of the environment auditors. Now, how will the certification and registration be done? It will be done either through the recognition of prior learning. The prior learning recognition will be provided to the experienced environment auditors, and there will be an exam also, the certification exam, and there will be a code of conduct which will be put in place. The guidelines will be issued by the central government. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for improving the process of EIA in India? One, we can suggest the establishment of an independent regulatory body to ensure that the environmental clearance, they are given timely but after due diligence. Simultaneously, the transparency can be promoted in public consultation, for example, getting the clearance certificate, the consent certificates, etc. We can integrate along with the EIA, the SIA and the CIA also. The SIA, that is social impact assessment, and CIA is the cumulative impact assessment to determine the cumulative impact of all the projects in that region, whether they will be causing significant environmental damage. There has to be a post monitoring mechanism also which should be put in place, and the accountabilities of authorities have to be ensured, and simultaneously a comprehensive legislation can also be brought in where there can be a clear devolution of the roles, responsibilities and powers of all the stakeholders. There is a means practice question also. Discuss the evolution of the environmental impact assessment framework in India, analyze the role of judiciary in shaping EIA norms, and suggest measures to strengthen the EIA process to ensure sustainable development. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the opening up of the nuclear sector in India. The government aims to liberalize the nuclear sector in India, so it wants to bring in more private players in the nuclear sector. But there are certain concerns. For example, the quality concerns are there in the supplier base. So we will discuss why do we need to increase the capacity of the nuclear sector in India and what are the challenges associated with it. This is important in GS3 under the topic infrastructure energy. First, let's discuss what are the sources of nuclear power in India, from where uranium can be exploited in India, where are the uranium mines located. In Meghalaya, there is the Domniasat and Madba. In Jharkhand, there is Jadugoda, Bhatin, Noapad, Turamdi. There is the Lambapur Pedagattu region, Tumlapalle and Gogi as well. Now let's also have a look at the nuclear power plants in India. There are some operational nuclear power plants, for example, Kudankulam, Kaiga, Tarapur, Kakrapar, Narora, etc. Then there are some nuclear power plants which are still being built under construction, for example, Mithivirdi, Kovada, etc. Now, why do we need to expand the capacity of the nuclear sector in India? Because when we look at the total installed power mix, nuclear energy contributes just 2% of India's total energy production, as per the Central Electricity Authority data of August 2024. When we compare it with the other countries, the share of nuclear energy in the total energy mix for India is very low, particularly compared to the Western countries also. So we need to increase the share of nuclear power in the total energy mix of India to ensure that India does not become energy scarce, India becomes self-sufficient in energy, and India is able to perform good on the human development parameters, for example, human development index, and the diversification of sources can be done because India imports 88% of India's crude oil needs, and energy security is of paramount nature. We also want to fulfill our climate change goals. We want to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions also. When we compare the greenhouse gas emissions from the nuclear power plants and the coal power plants, the difference is huge. The GHG emissions from the nuclear power plants is 100 times less than that of the coal power plants. And also the cost of the nuclear power plant is location independent. It can be located anywhere as compared to coal. The coal plants have to be located near to the coal mines only. Otherwise, the transportation cost of the coal itself will be huge and the per unit cost itself will become huge. As we compare it with the renewable energy, other sources, for example, the solar energy, wind energy, they also have their own concerns. For example, the solar and wind energy, they are intermittent in nature. The solar energy is available during the day only. It has to be stored by using batteries or other means, and for the nighttime supply, the stored energy has to be used. Therefore, they are not base load capable. That is, they cannot supply a constant energy for 24 hours continuously at a base load, and therefore the balancing costs are also involved. That is, sometimes the energy which is available from the renewable sources, that is more than the requirement, and sometimes the energy which is available is less than the requirement. Therefore the grid has to be balanced. The balancing cost of the grid increases if the higher amount of energy is coming from the renewable sources. Simultaneously, there are external costs also, for example, the environmental cost, health impacts, etc. And India has also given a target to itself to achieve 100 gigawatt of the energy production from the nuclear energy by 2047. Now let's also discuss briefly the three-stage nuclear power program of India. We put in place a three-stage nuclear power program to utilize our thorium reserves. We do not have significant uranium reserves, but we have one of the largest thorium reserves in the world. Therefore, we put in place a three-stage program in which the first stage was the pressurized heavy water reactor, followed by the second stage of fast breeder reactor, and the third stage of uranium-233 fueled breeders. We chose the first stage of pressurized heavy water reactor because it was feasible to produce the heavy water domestically, and along with it, the pressurized heavy water reactor did not require enriched uranium as the input. Natural uranium could be used as the input for the pressurized heavy water reactor. Therefore, in the first stage, we are utilizing uranium-235, the natural uranium, as the input for the pressurized heavy water reactor. The output from the first stage is some electricity. Along with that, there is the spent fuel, the depleted uranium, the uranium-238, along with it some plutonium also, the plutonium-239. The outputs from the first stage, they are utilized as the input for the second stage, the fast breeder reactor, which also utilizes some natural uranium along with the spent fuel of the first stage. Now these are breeder reactors, therefore they produce plutonium also, and along with it uranium-233 as well as some electricity. The uranium-233 which is utilized for the third stage, it is got from the second stage only. The output from the second stage, that is uranium-233, that is used as the input for the third stage, which is also a breeder, along with the input of some thorium which produces electricity finally. Now the government aims to liberalize the nuclear sector. It wants to bring in more private players. Therefore, it seeks to amend the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act, Section 17 specifically of the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act, as it provides for the supplier liability clause, that in case there is an accident, then the supplier will be held liable. The component supplier will be held liable if there is a radiation leak, for example, or nuclear meltdown, etc. This had discouraged the component suppliers in the past, for example, Westinghouse, Areva. Now, when we compare it with the standards in the other countries, in France, UK, and Japan, absolute liability is assigned, but the liability has been capped. The total liability that can be imposed upon the suppliers and operators, that has been capped, therefore they are protected. In the USA also, there is a Price-Anderson Act which has been in place since 1957. There the total liability has been capped, the operator's liability to $16 billion. Even the suppliers are also protected. Now India is also taking steps in this direction to limit the liability, but there are certain concerns also. For example, the concerns are raised regarding the independence of the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board and even the resources which are there at the disposal of the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board in India to ensure the effective implementation. And there are even concerns that the liberalization could even dilute the safety standards. We have also seen in the past the Bhopal gas tragedy, for example. Now, who will pay then? In case things go wrong in the future, then who will be paying if the liability of the suppliers is also capped? If we look at the current status, the operator liability is about 1500 crores and the current government funded insurance pool is to the tune of 2300 crores. But when we look at the cleanup cost in case there is a disaster, a nuclear disaster, it will be huge. When we look at the cleanup cost of Fukushima disaster, it was to the tune of 45,000 crore rupees. Therefore, the numbers do not match. Now coming to the article, there are second and third tier suppliers also. They are supplying parts to the tier 1 suppliers, for example, the L&T, Bharat Forge, Godrej, Walchandnagar Industries, etc. And these suppliers, they fabricate core components including the end shields, moderator, heat exchangers, dump tanks, fuel magazines, etc. But they themselves are also dependent upon smaller input providers as well. Not only there are quality concerns in this, also the global players have also flagged the need for a robust cyber security protocol also simultaneously. Now there will be concerns that if there are quality concerns and cost overruns, it will lead to the delays in the already capital intensive nuclear sector. For example, in Finland, the Olkiluoto 3 EPR nuclear reactor got delayed by about 12 years. And the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board in India primarily focuses on the design certifications, whereas the quality aspects, they are largely handled by the operator largely by the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited. Although the safety record of NPCIL has been strong, there have been no radiological accidents across so many reactors that are being operated, but the problem remains regarding the tier 2 suppliers, their quality concerns and the expertise of the smaller reactor types that is there, but we are also dependent upon the pressurized heavy water reactor technology as well. Therefore, there are need for the quality upgradation in the supply chain, and we can borrow the templates from two countries in Japan as well as in China. China rolled out a comprehensive nuclear quality assurance program which was focused on the regulatory framework aligned with the international standards, and it is overseen by the National Nuclear Safety Administration in China. Now, what are the other challenges that persist regarding the nuclear power adoption in India? One of the challenges that has been there since decades has been the international collaboration. For example, we collaborated with the USA regarding the boiling water reactors in Tarapur in 1960s, but the supplies were stopped. The fuel supplies were stopped post 1974 due to geopolitical reasons from USA. After that, we had to rely upon the French and Russian fuel after 1974. Similarly, we had the collaboration with Canada regarding the pressurized heavy water reactors in Rajasthan. But after 1974, again there were stoppage of supplies from there, and we were helped by Russia at that time as well, the heavy water production, etc. Regarding the foreign reactors, imports and their liability, we have seen the delays that happened in Kudankulam. where the Russian help was also sought, and the delays were to the tune of more than 13 years. There are challenges even after the nuclear deal of 2008, the 123 agreement we signed with the USA to ensure further nuclear cooperation with the USA, which we were not getting earlier as we were not part of the nuclear suppliers group. There are challenges still, for example, the liability clause that had deterred the suppliers, the vendors in the past, and the NPCIL even had to waive the clauses for the establishment of Kakrapar 3. Another challenge is the fuel cycle and its reprocessing also. In the front end, there is the challenge that the uranium deposits in India, they are mostly low grade deposits, and the waste management challenges are also there because we have a low volume production of the nuclear energy in India, and the waste will be therefore high level, and there have to be deep geological repositories also. They will have to be preferred for ensuring long term disposal. Then there are safety challenges and safety concerns as well. For example, the quality concerns already highlighted through the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, and also the past experience, for example, Chernobyl disaster, Fukushima disaster. And there are stalled projects also. For example, the bankruptcies which are filed by the nuclear component suppliers, for example in USA, AP1000. Even the initial capital which is required for the establishment of the nuclear power plant, it is huge, and there are land acquisition problems also. For example, we have experienced in Kudankulam in Tamil Nadu. Then there are cheaper alternatives also which are available. For example, the cost of the solar energy, wind energy, that is to the tune of just 3 to 4 rupees per unit electricity production, whereas as per the estimates of Department of Atomic Energy itself, the cost of production from Chaya, Mitivirdi, etc., that will be closer to 10 rupees per unit. Therefore, the renewable energy alternatives are rather cheaper. Then the human resources also have to be trained. The number of academic courses specifically in the nuclear energy sector, they have declined, although there are training programs which are given by the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited and the BARC also. And there is simultaneously an underutilization of the experience, the retired professionals who are already there in India. At the same time, there is brain drain as well, that the skilled professionals in the sector, they rather seek greener pastures, they go for opportunities in other countries. There is a mains practice question also. Discuss the role of nuclear power in meeting India's growing energy demands and climate commitments. Examine the challenges associated with greater private sector participation in India's nuclear energy sector. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the strategic autonomy in a multipolar world. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developed and Developing Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. Before coming to the article, let's discuss what are the concerns, what are the challenges for India in navigating the current geopolitics. First, there are certain concerns for India due to the rent-seeking behavior of USA. For example, it is going for punitive tariff hikes. It has imposed a total of 50% tariffs on India, 25% citing its national interest, and 25% citing it as penalty on India for buying oil from Russia, which is completely unreasonable, as it is not India which is causing the Russia-Ukraine war. And it is resorting, USA is resorting to economic coercion as a policy measure. It is using it against both allies as well as adversaries, threatening with tariffs to ensure the alignments as per its own interests. It is even going for direct targeting of strategic partnerships. For example, it is coercing India to soften its collaboration, to lessen its collaboration with Russia, with whom we have a strategic partnership. Simultaneously, it has led to, the actions of USA have led to the erosion of trust and reliability in the India-USA relations. It is also going for a pressure building tactic, pressuring India to make a binary choice. Choose either USA or the other blocs, whether it is Russia or it is SCO or BRICS, etc., criticizing all of them. And it has stalled the trade negotiations as well, therefore. And Indian exports to USA are adversely impacted immensely, that too. And there is a forced diversification, therefore, that Indian exporters have to do. They are seeking markets elsewhere in the other countries, in the developing countries, Africa and Latin America. It has led to the key sectors in India becoming vulnerable, especially the red lines that India have regarding the sectors like agriculture and pharmaceutical, USA is not listening to India's interests, and the labor intensive sectors are particularly impacted. It will also undermine India's leadership, the leadership of the global south. India has served as a bridge between the global south and the global north, but it will be undermining India's leadership that way, and there will be a challenge to the hedging strategy. India has always gone for strategic autonomy in the multipolar world, but this hedging strategy that may not work because of the pressures from USA, which is asking India to choose sides rather. Now, what will be the challenges for India therefore in the upcoming multipolar world? One, there will be more unpredictability. More unpredictability, as there will be constant recalibration of the relationships, the speed at which the countries will change sides, the permutations of the alliances that will be formed and again formed, the dizzying speed at which it will be happening. It will be difficult to calculate the cost benefit analysis, and there will be a simultaneously erosion of reliable partnerships. There might be no cozy certainty in future. There won't be any grandfathers in the future, and therefore it might affect the strategic interests of developing nations, for example India as well. Simultaneously, there is a myth that the multilateralism is also on the rise. Rather, the reality is multilateralism is not rising. It is often mistakenly conflated. The concept of the multipolarity is mistakenly conflated with multilateralism. The multipolarity is there and it will rise, but the multilateralism has been declining. There has been a decline of the multilateral institutions, for example, the effectiveness of the UNGA, effectiveness of the WTO, etc. And there is a real risk of a solitary existence, because every country will be putting their interest first. Even when China is able to cut a deal with US, it will be doing that also, and therefore the strategic autonomy that we will be upholding, but whether we will be navigating the challenging alone, that will be seen in the future only. Plus, India's position is still that of a secondary power, and therefore we are vulnerable to the pressure and the bullying tactics from the Western nations, especially USA. Now, coming to the article refers to the strategic autonomy as the ability of the nation to make sovereign decisions in foreign policy and defense without being constrained by the external pressures or alliance obligations. It is not synonymous with the isolationism or neutrality, and we have upheld our strategic autonomy in the past also. For example, the historical roots that India have borrowed, going back to the colonial subjugation, we always were determined to not let anybody else decide our place in the world. Therefore, when we track the foreign policy of India, Nehru went for non-alignment during the Cold War, and the Modi government went for the multi-alignment in the current era. So in theory, the strategic autonomy offers that middle path, the balance, the golden mean between being a rigid bloc, the rigid bloc politics, and going for a passive disengagement. India's relationship with USA, when we consider, it has deepened considerably in the past 2 decades. We have defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, technology transfers, etc. There are groupings involving India and USA both, including the Quad grouping, Indo-Pacific dialogues, I2U2, the India-Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, etc. They have the shared concerns over the rise of China. When we look at our ties with China, China presents a complex riddle for us. We have challenges also that we need to navigate, and we have advantages also. The challenges include the border clashes with China, for example, the Galwan Valley, the Doklam Plateau issue, and China is also a competitor of India, but simultaneously, it is also one of India's largest trading partners. It is also having a leading place in some of the regional institutions in which India also participates. Therefore, India's approach has been one of cautious engagement, but at the same time firm deterrence. So we are strengthening the border infrastructure. At the same time, we are deepening our ties with the Indo-Pacific partners, and we are investing in the indigenous defense capabilities also. So the strategic autonomy here does not mean that we are either confronting or capitulating. It means maintaining that balance, and we are refusing to be pawn of a great power in the great power game, and we are refusing to be another country's counterweight to a rising China. When we look at similarly our relationship with Russia, it is rooted in the Cold War solidarity. We have defense cooperation with them, we have shared strategic interests also. Therefore, we buy oil also from them, we import weapons, and we engage diplomatically as well. Therefore, the strategic autonomy is about refusing to choose the sides in a binary contest. Instead, we are crafting a foreign policy that reflects India's aspirations, India's history, India's geography, and India's national interest. This we can term it as a diplomacy with a spine, where we are having an aggressive, pragmatic, at the same time unapologetically Indian nature, seeking to be non-West rather than being anti-West. And this stance also resonates with the global south also, because the global south, the rising and the middle powers, they are rather concerned with the peace and stability in their own regions. They are choosing to safeguard their geopolitical and economic interests rather than being swept in the great power rivalries. So they seek voice, they do not seek vassalage. And in a world of cyber threats, we also need to at the same time ensure that the artificial intelligence warfare, the space competition autonomy must extend beyond these traditional domains. It must encompass the data sovereignty, digital infrastructure, and the supply chain security as well. The next article is related to the floods in Punjab and why does Punjab keep getting flooded. This is important in GS3 under the topic disaster and disaster management. Punjab got its name from the fact that through this region 5 rivers were flowing. In India, in today's Punjab, 3 perennial rivers Ravi, Byas and Satluj flow through it, and there is one seasonal river also, that is Ghaggar. So why does Punjab keep getting flooded? Primarily because of its natural geography. It is a land of the rivers, 3 perennial rivers and 1 seasonal river. Now these rivers can be a boon also and they can be a bane also. They are a boon because they bring alluvium along with it. Therefore, Punjab is one of the most fertile areas in India, and therefore it produces about 20% of India's wheat and 12% of India's rice, becoming the food bowl of India. But simultaneously, there are heavy rainfalls in the upstream catchment areas, which causes flooding in the Punjab region. Then there are extreme rainfall events also. The heavy monsoon rains, they overwhelm the flood defenses, they break the embankments of the rivers, and the upstream states as well as Punjab, they receive excess rainfall. For example, this year they have received more than 45% excess rainfall. Then there are dam management issues also. For example, the upstream dams Bakhda, Pong and Theme, they release water without information sometimes to the downstream areas, and there is a perceived lack of flood cushion. The reservoirs, they are usually kept at the higher levels of storage for ensuring irrigation needs are met and the power is generated, and there is very little buffer that is kept. In case there is sudden rainfall in the upper catchment areas, it is immediately released from the reservoirs, and there is sudden and large volume water releases without timely warnings at times, and there is a poor coordination which is seen in the past between the dam operators and the Punjab state officials. Another reason is the inadequate infrastructure. For example, the earthen embankments have been breached in the past. They are known as the Dosi Bunds. The illegal mining also happens in the riverbeds, which weaken the structural integrity of the embankments. There is a lack of investment also. The lack of investment in the desilting of the rivers, lack of investment in the building of strong flood defense systems. There are concerns in the governance as well and the institutional challenges. For example, the key dams like the Bhakra Management Board, they are having centralized control. Their primary mandate is to go for maximum irrigation, maximum power rather than flood control. And the government usually has a reactive approach allegedly, as it wakes up only after the floods. There is poor communication, a lack of communication between different departments in Punjab also. For example, the barrage gates, they are not opened on time. The next article is related to the mineral exploration and exemptions for mineral exploration in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and also under conservation, environmental pollution and degradation. Before coming to the article, let's discuss the provisions of National Mineral Policy 2019. Its vision is to promote the domestic industry, promote the private sector participation, and to ensure fair, transparent, and equitable distribution of mines and mineral resources in India. It promotes the ease of doing business by providing simpler clearances, time-bound clearances, and to prevent illegal mining also by implementing e-governance and IT-enabled monitoring. It provides for the establishment of a national authority for the mineral development and coordination in India. It also focuses on the critical, strategic and deep-seated minerals and incentivizes the exploration through the right to first refusal and maintenance of a national mineral inventory. For mining operations, it promotes the zero waste mining, investments in the mining technology, research and development in the technology, as well as the development of dedicated mineral corridors. To ensure sustainability, it provides that the ecological fragile areas can be designated as the no-go zones for mining. There the mining cannot happen, and the utilization of renewable energy should be done at the mining sites. It provides for the scientific mine closure when the mineral exploration has ended at that place and the reclamation of the land, and also the shared inheritance is held in trust for the future generations, for the posterity. And to promote the social responsibility, it provides that there should be comprehensive relief and rehabilitation for the project affected persons, and the devolution of mining benefits should happen through the district mineral foundations, and it protects the interests of the tribals also. In the economic and fiscal measures, it seeks to attract the FDI in the mining sector and seeks to put in place an import-export policy for the mines and minerals, and it gives the status of an industry to the mining sector, and it also seeks to benchmark the fiscal regimes, that is royalties and taxes, which can be imposed upon the mineral exploration with the global standards, and it also promotes the financing for the exploration of minerals. Now coming to the article, the Union Environment Ministry has approved the request to allow more boreholes to be drilled on the forest land for the mineral exploration activity. For this mineral exploration, by drilling the boreholes are narrow, deep holes for exploring whether a mineral is present beneath the ground there. For this, the clearance under the Van Sanrakshan Evam Samvardhan Adhiniyam 1980 will not be required. While granting the relaxation, certain conditions have been imposed by the government, that there should be minimum impact of the drilling on the wildlife. There should be the survey and exploration activities like drilling limited from 9 am to 5:30 pm to align with the diurnal pattern of wildlife. Also, the borehole should be plugged with cement also immediately after the completion of all related activities. Now there are concerns as well that the impacts can occur on the riparian ecosystems if the water is blocked and abstracted from the forested stream. It can result into the discharge of oil or grease into the natural water stream as well, which can have a negative impact on the aquatic wildlife. Therefore, the SOP for the mineral exploration in forest areas is to be followed, and the SOP states that no drilling should be allowed within high sensitivity areas to protect the ecological hotspots. The next article is related to the reservation in private colleges. This is important in GS2 under the topic Indian Constitution Significant Provisions. Before coming to the article, let's discuss the evolution of the reservation in private unaided institutions in India. In TMA Pai Foundation versus Union of India case, the court observed that there cannot be any reservation, any quotas which can be imposed upon the privately operated schools. The same line of argument was adopted in the PA Inamdar case. In PA Inamdar versus State of Maharashtra case, the court held that reservation cannot be mandated in the private institutions, private unaided institutions. They have to be allowed to operate autonomously. But then the government came up with Article 15 Clause 5. The Article 15 Clause 5 was inserted into the Constitution. It provides the enabling power to the state. The state can mandate the private unaided institutions also to provide reservations. Then in Ashok Kumar Thakur versus Union of India case, the court observed that the affirmative actions are legitimate. And specifically in Indian Medical Association versus Union of India case, the court observed that the merit and social justice, they have to coexist, and substantive equality has to be maintained. For that, affirmative actions are needed. And in Pramati Educational and Cultural Trust versus Union of India, specifically Article 15 Clause 5 was held to be constitutionally valid, that the state can provide for reservation in the private unaided institutions also. Now coming to the article, a parliamentary committee report has observed that the students from disadvantaged communities are underrepresented in the private universities, with only 0.89% of the students from the scheduled caste communities and 0.53% from the scheduled tribes and 11.16% from the other backward classes communities in the private universities in India. And the Standing Committee on Education's report to the Parliament has recommended that the government should pass a law implementing Article 15 Clause 5 of the Constitution. The next article is related to the Emerging Science, Technology and Innovation Conclave, which is supposed to replace the Indian Science Congress. This is important in GS3 under the topic Achievements of Indians in Science and Technology and Indigenization of Technology. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding Indian Science Congress. It is an annual gathering of the researchers. It is organized by the Indian Science Congress Association. It is a professional body under the Department of Science and Technology under Ministry of Science and Technology. The first meeting of the Indian Science Congress was held in 1914. It was held at the premises of the Asiatic Society, Calcutta, which was founded by Sir William Jones. And there are 14 sections in Indian Science Congress, including Agriculture and Forestry Sciences, Earth System Sciences, Engineering Sciences, Environmental Sciences, Mathematical Sciences, as well as Medical Sciences. Now coming to the article, the Emerging Science, Technology and Innovation Conclave may replace the Indian Science Congress, which is the oldest congregation of scientists in India with a rich history predating independence. But in 2024 and this year also, the Science Congress was not held because of a dispute between the Department of Science and Technology and the authority's executive body over the organization of the event. The DST has said that it will no longer be funding the Indian Science Congress Authority, and the inaugural Emerging Science, Technology and Innovation Conclave will be held at the Bharat Mandapam in the month of November. Thank you.